Welcome to Community Conversations. My name is Peter Fosek. I'm the Secretary-Treasurer of Connecticut Tenants Union, and tonight I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Luke Milanakis Harrison.
Great to be here. I'm Vice President and Political Director of Connecticut Tenants Union. I was there in the beginning when we were first getting tenant unions organized. For the first time in the serious way this century, Connecticut has a legacy of tenant unions going back, to the 60s, 70s, and 80s. A lot of the tenant rights that we have now and enjoy now were won in those decades by tenants getting organized and pushing for them. That form of organizing, particularly as tenants organizing themselves into unions, had kind of gone dormant in the past several decades. Mm-hmm. With the combination of COVID, skyrocketing rental prices in 2020 and the subsequent years, the uprisings of that summer, 2020, and just a lot of other pressures on people trying to find housing and a deepening housing crisis. I've been really privileged to be a part of the kind of new wave of tenant union organizing in this state that kicked off in 2020, 2021, and has now brought us to where we are today as a statewide union of tenants building a movement that's, taken off in a lot of ways.
Exciting to be able to say that.
Yeah.
I obviously benefited from you diving in from the get-go, as you say, of that 21st century tenant movement here in Connecticut, having gotten to town a year after you did, 4+ years down the road from that initial organizing experience here, but also a year and a half or so into doing tenant union organizing as your full-time job and being a key founding leader of this movement. Mm-hmm. Looking back at that incipient moment of first coming to Connecticut and starting to figure out what it meant to build a tenants movement, much less put it into practice. Are there any particular insights that you might give to yourself 4 years ago?
So many lessons learned. It's hard to know exactly where to start. I think one that immediately comes to mind is just, if you see a need and you can find other people who see the need there, and you can come to enough of an agreement about what needs to be done in response to that need, it's absolutely amazing how much is actually possible. Mm-hmm. I think that before getting involved in all of this, I had a much more, frankly, pessimistic and cynical perspective on social change. Mm-hmm. And our ability to see real problems in the world and do something about it. I remember 2020 sort of in the depths of the pandemic shutdowns, and I'd been going through a lot in my personal life, and there was so much chaos happening nationally, politically. I was really acutely aware of climate change that year too. Mm-hmm. I remember we had lots of severe weather events. I remember just feeling overwhelmed by the state of the world, mm-hmm. in this place of anxiety and just grief. Now, after having been a part of this movement for the past few years, and realizing what is actually possible when people get together and get on the same page about taking action, mm-hmm. how much actually is possible, I feel so much more hopeful and encouraged and empowered. I have a different perspective on life after this experience. Change is possible. The only thing that's holding us back from the world that we would all want to see is making the choice that we want to fight to get there. Right. And recognizing that it is a fight. The world is the way that it is because some people benefit from it being that way. Yeah. And that means that it's going to take a fight to change things, but there's a lot of other people who are ready for that. And I think it's been profoundly inspiring to have met so many people who are ready to take action, even when it involves personal risk, in order to make changes that really need to be made.
Absolutely. I think that is a characteristically beautiful and insightful way of putting it. I mean, that change is not only necessary and urgently so under the conditions that we're facing, but it also is possible.
Right.
but this is, my words, not yours, but only insofar as we act to create that change.
Right.
Faith in the possibilities of the future is great, but faith without deeds is dead.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that certainly from our first conversation in the fall of 2021 all the way up through now that I've really seen you exhibit and embody in doing this work. Coming to Connecticut with explicit intention of figuring out some kind of opportunity to align with like-minded individuals to build the world that we deserve rather than the one that we see was an effort definitely made possible by our first conversation and those that followed, because I think you do an extraordinary job of embodying that spirit. And you say that kind of key recognition of change is possible, things are possible.
Yeah.
What is possible in your vision? What does that look like?
The short answer would be it's possible for everybody to have a home. A world where people are sleeping outside and people are breathing in moldy air in a rundown apartment, or where people are making heart-wrenching decisions about what to spend their money on in order to make the rent, et cetera, things that you and I see every day in the tenant union, is not inevitable. It doesn't have to be that way. Everybody could have a home where they feel safe and healthy and dignified. And I think part and parcel of that is also the belief that more democracy is possible. It's possible for more people to have more say over their own lives and to handle that responsibility with others and to do it well. So much of our society concentrates a lot of power in the hands of a small number of people, and that breeds a lot of the problems and social ills and injustices that are so devastating to behold. And I think part of what we're doing in the tenant union is premised on this idea that more and more of us, just everyday people who don't have a lot of money, don't have a lot of property, don't have a lot of connection, don't have a lot of privilege, can band together with our neighbors and make a commitment to our mutual and collective well-being, and we can look out for each other, and we can do it. We can make decisions collectively and democratically, and it's tricky, and people have different personalities, and they're coming from incredibly different backgrounds. I've never been in a more diverse community than in the tenant union, which is something I love about it so much. But it's possible.
Right.
It's possible. It's not perfect, but it's truly possible to bring people into decision-making power over their own lives, and to do that in a way that's not competitive and zero-sum, but that's actually about the well-being of a whole community, a whole apartment complex, a whole neighborhood.
With that in mind, I would make the claim that it actually is competitive in a sense, but not in a zero-sum game sense. As a lifelong team athlete, I think that there's nothing that I've experienced that resembles what it's like to be on a highly competitive team quite as much as working in the tenants union resembles that, because I think that competition isn't about beating somebody who's designated and other who's designated in opposition, but it's instead about competing with oneself on behalf of one's team, one's community, to elevate that collective and to push the boundaries of what you think is possible for you to do. I think we're competing every day, but competing as members of a team and competing to elevate all of us together by elevating each of us as an individual. Doing exactly what you're describing, right? By recognizing that we do actually understand the conditions that we're living in. And if the ills that we experience in our lived reality are to be addressed, they're not going to be addressed by some abstract top-down policy proposal solution that is engaging with the crisis as something of a thought experiment, but instead, if it's going to be solved, it'll be solved by those experiencing most acutely the nature and the impacts of the crisis
Yeah.
in directly intervening to empower themselves to be a little cliche, the change that we want to see in the world,
Yeah.
having recognized that the price of obedience to the world that is has become too high.
I really appreciate that point, and I think this is a perspective that you are really often helpful in bringing. The point about like a sort of positive understanding of competition or even discipline that it takes to build an organization, to show leadership to a lot of different kinds of people, to, build a kind of community that is capable of tension, that's capable of conflict, that's capable of disagreement, that's capable of repair and reconciliation, etc. Because that's what we've been doing the past few years, is building something from zero, and at a pretty remarkable pace, finding ourselves with a lot of people, a lot of responsibility, and a lot of decisions to make all the time. I mean, you're the secretary treasurer. You got all the finances to worry about. Is so much the lifeblood of an organization. Experience of building an organization, building a union, building a movement has made a lot of those words much less romantic to me.
Mm-hmm.
The movement has this sort of romantic sound to it, but in the everyday practice, it's just people taking action together, deliberating about what the action's going to be, and then following through. And that does take a high level of sort of, as you said, competition with oneself, because there's a sense of all striving for a shared goal, which is the unifying thing, I would say, is the shared sense of a commitment to a vision that's coming from a place of both the understanding of how dire the circumstances are currently when it comes to housing, and how absolutely unacceptable what is termed in the media as the housing crisis has become, and how devastating the effects of that are. So there's sort of the negative motivation of things as they currently are cannot go on and we must change them. But then there's the positive vision of what is possible when we do get on the same page and reach consensus about a better vision. Yeah.
The positive framing of the movement, I think, is really vital. To your point there, and your point earlier about possibility of change and the possibility of transformation from that which is to that which could be. I agree. I think that is predicated on individuals recognizing that much of the suffering they experience in the day-to-day is not due to their own shortcomings or failure or faults, despite the fact that there are a whole lot of well-established, deeply entrenched narratives out there interpolating to all of us that is the source of our discontents. Mm-hmm. But individuals recognize that's not in fact the case, that maybe it's not a matter of personal failure, but a matter of the world as it exists being built for people who are not them, who are not you or I. And enough of us come to that realization, we can build a world that is suited to our interests and aims. But I think that this is also the exciting promise of this, right? That is hard wood. Mm-hmm. And it's also, fundamentally, it needs to be collaborative work, right? Discontented with the way of the world generally aren't the beneficiaries of the way it's set up right now. So there's not a ton of capital necessarily on the side pushing for that kind of change.
Right.
Not a whole lot of resources in hand, but the most valuable resource out there is people.
Right.
Is that human capital that really is simultaneously the instrument and the artist that can create that which could be. And I think that in that necessity of collaboration, because we need to work together to amplify the power, the voice, the momentum that any one of us as an individual can generate, that means that we have to come up with solutions that are not oriented in a zero-sum direction, right? That are asking the question not of how can I personally profit from this, how can this benefit me and my individual interest and aims, but how can I recognize myself in somebody else and in that recognition be motivated to work at a very difficult and amorphous task with this other person, with these other people, recognizing that we have similar interests, if not exactly the same, and figuring out how to mediate our differences along the way so as to create a harmoniously integrated whole of an incredible diversity of parts that is able to be much stronger than the sum of its parts.
Yeah. If I can reflect on what you just said for a second, because it connects to something that happened today, sort of in the day-to-day of the tenant union, I feel like this work is so deeply premised on neighbors who live next to each other in an apartment building becoming human beings to each other, going from being just pure strangers that maybe you pass in a hallway or in a parking lot, but otherwise have no idea who that person is or what their life is like, to being in meetings together, knocking on each other's door, being in meetings together, having to take action together and work on documents together and strategize, and in the process learn a whole lot about someone who was purely a stranger to you before. Now they're a whole human being with a whole complicated life, just as complicated as yours. That's kind of like the DNA of the tenant union.
Yeah. There
are other moments in this work where not just neighbors become human beings to each other, but it happens across the bargaining table sometimes. We've got tenants representing the union on one side and a property owner, a landlord or CEO on the other side. Mentally, it's an antagonistic relationship. One side of the table wants to make as much money off of the property as possible, and the other side wants to pay as little in rent as possible, and those are kind of split interests. Moments of humanization can happen, even moments of relationship in a sometimes surprising way can happen. One of our tenant unions has been in a collective bargaining process with their landlord for months, reached a tentative agreement, was hoping to sign the contract by Veterans Day weekend, but has not been able to get a hold of him for over a month now, and was starting to really feel like, is he reneging on the agreement? Are we going to have to escalate pressure again? What's going on? Why is he ghosting us? Put a call into his secretary today and found out that none of that is the case. He actually just lost his son, tragically. Obviously, that was horrible and horrific news to hear. And there was just something about the fact that there was a phone call made, and instead of gearing up for a protest, now the union is sending condolence flowers and thinking about how can they express sympathy to this man and his grief. And I was just sort of walking away from that interaction being like, this whole movement is just about human beings recognizing each other as human beings.
Yeah.
And seeing what is possible when we do that. And I don't want to be naive about it because, as I said, there are real economic interests here that are oppositional.
Right.
And it's part of why what our sort of vision for housing is to take away the inherently oppositional relationship of tenant and landlord into a new model of apartment housing. But I'm also not naive, on the other hand, about the fact that everybody is just a human being. It's actually, it's for everybody from the governor to, the guy who's like doing the landscaping at the apartment complex. Everybody is an equally complex and multifaceted human being. I don't know if that resonates with you at all, but it's such a feature of this work,
No, it really is, and it, in part because we're gearing up for the second year of our Just Cause legislative campaign to expand Just Cause eviction protections to all tenants in the state of Connecticut. We're talking about, the the legislative lobbying experience and individual constituent representative meetings. And we've been having our first meetings with members of the Connecticut General Assembly. I've been thinking about how that mutual humanization is not only true neighbor to neighbor or tenant union member to tenant union member in different corners of the state or across the country, as we've experienced as we've branched out and affiliated with other groups nationally. The thing that really excites me about this work is that building this movement, empowering tenants to be stakeholders in their homes, to be able to consequently cultivate their communities and pursue a life in which they can thrive in the place that they are as active participants in the civic life of that place, and in its economy and in its community. That is also grafted onto the legislative campaigning that we do. Something quite unique about this movement is that to support a movement that has all those characteristics I just listed is to invest in democracy.
Yeah.
And we see that in a really embodied form every time we show up at the Capitol. And you can see the kind of shock and confusion, at least initially, when we showed up for our public hearing in 2023 with hundreds of people and we must have had over 1,000 people testify on our side, and then kept coming back for lobby days, for rallies, and then did it again last year in a much more strategically sound and organized method, thanks to your steering on that front. The conversations that our members are able to have with their representatives really kind of fundamentally alters the nature of the conversation. It changes it from something that is a thought experiment, a policy proposal problem, an MBA problem set exercise, even a question of economics and business interest, to a question of human life and well-being. That's really what it is. I mean, when your housing doesn't work, nothing else in your life works. And we see that every day. We see how this is a public health issue and a public health crisis. The housing crisis and the crisis of tenancy, as rents skyrocket and eviction rates go up and displacement goes up alongside it, is the homelessness crisis. It's also the mold and respiratory disease crisis. It's also mental health crisis, childhood development, educational outcome crisis, all because of the fundamentally intersectional nature of housing. When folks mobilize around their shared interest, their class interest as tenants, and go to the legislature saying, we are your constituents with just as valid a claim on your time and your interest as anybody else in your constituency. It's not a matter of optimizing a profit and loss statement. It's an issue of life and death. It's an issue of, am I going to be able to put food on the table for my kids? And am I going to be able to guarantee that they don't get unnecessarily sick, seriously ill, simply because somebody doesn't want to pay to upkeep the place that we're living, and we do not have the legal right to do so ourselves because we don't have $40,000 sitting around to put down as a down payment. That humanization, I think, has really made what we've done in the legislature as unprecedented as it's been in terms of the momentum we've garnered over such a short time period. The folks in the legislature listen, because they're talking to human beings and they're human beings, and it really, I think, is a necessary predicate of any understanding that can then motivate a collaboration between the powers that be and those who have been all too often forgotten by the power structures that exist.
The specific piece of legislation that we're ready to campaign around when the legislative session starts again in January is such a good example of that. Eviction and the laws around it and the court process around it is something that not a lot of people are familiar with unless they've gone through it themselves, which 1 in 20 renter households have in 2024. A stat that I just learned that was pretty jolting even for me. I mean, that's 1 in 20 is a really high percentage of people to go through the deeply traumatizing experience of eviction. But unless you're in that category or have interacted with the court process of eviction in another way, most people have not a lot of understanding of how that works, what that looks like. And if we talk about just cause eviction purely in the register of court processes and, legal details, it can mask what we're really getting at when we're talking about it, which is everything that you just described, people's experiences of not knowing that they're going to have a place to sleep that's going to be safe and secure next month.
Yeah.
That's what just cause is about, is an assurance that at minimum, if you are kind of able to keep up with the rent, which is hard enough to do, abiding by the lease, not bothering anyone, not harming anyone, you can sleep easy at night knowing that you're not going to be tossed out all of a sudden without even a justification for it, not even accusing you of doing something that then you could then try to remedy, but simply for no fault, a no fault eviction. And that's what just cause is about. It's just saying, as a tenant, you don't have a lot of protections.
Yeah.
At least you should have the assurance that you can't be kicked out without a valid reason, because we're talking about your housing. We're talking about the roof over your head, with the foundation of the entire rest of your life, where your kids go to school and your doctor's appointments are scheduled and you have a way to get to work and you have a life. You can't just be fully uprooted out of your life because there was a change of property ownership and the new investor from New York wants to double the rent.
Right.
It's not a good enough reason to kick somebody out of their home.
Right.
It's only when tenants are telling the story that a housing policy is going to be framed in that way. I mean, we have many allies and advocates whom we love and appreciate, but it is different when it's people telling their own stories and speaking to the issues from their own felt experience and what they are seeing around them in their own community, versus a kind of outsider's view, as sympathetic as that outsider might be, trying to talk about something that's inherently distant and abstract to them. That's the difference the tenant union is making in the realm of legislation and politics. It's tenants speaking for ourselves about our experiences and what, we're asking for protection from certain kinds of eviction, us telling the legislature directly what that means and what the lack of it will continue to mean, because that's what we're seeing all around us.
Yeah.
As tenants, just in our communities, this extreme vulnerability to instability and displacement, and this overwhelming feeling of like, how do you plan ahead in your life? How do you have a sense of being able to really put down roots in a place over time if it can be so arbitrary that you're going to lose your home and there's nothing you can do to stop it? Now, no matter how hard you work or how consistent you are on the rent, it doesn't matter if no-fault evictions are as easy as they currently are. Hopefully we can get that message across in an even louder and more powerful way than we did in the legislative session of 2024. I'm confident that we will, because I'm confident that even more people will be there to share that message with us.
Without a doubt.
What's wild about this movement is just how quickly it's growing.
It's because people recognize the need.
Yeah.
The message resonates when folks see others organizing around this and recognize that, I'm not the only one, and maybe it's not because of anything I've done. Maybe this is a system set up to exploit and extract, and maybe there's something we can do.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's all we got for tonight, but thank you for joining us for this community conversation.